The 911 dispatcher had heard hundreds of such calls, but the one from Eleanor Vance was the first of its kind. Instead of screaming, panicking, or pleading for help, the woman quietly and casually stated that she had woken up in the morning and found Caleb not at home. She did not explain to the operator who he was to her or how old he was. She only said that someone had broken in during the night and taken him, and then she fell silent, as if waiting for further instructions. The dispatcher tried to get some details from her, but quickly realized it was useless. Eleanor's answers were short, general, and confused. She couldn't recall any specifics of the night, hadn't heard any sounds, and hadn't noticed anything unusual. The entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, after which she hung up herself, calmly and abruptly, just as she had started the call. When the police arrived at the address, the officers immediately sensed that something was wrong. The doors of the house were locked and appeared untouched. The house itself was a perfect example of suburban order. Yet, even at the threshold, the officers were met with a pungent smell of chlorine, so strong it seemed someone had tried to scrub every surface in the house overnight. At that time, they did not yet know that this unusual cleanliness would be the beginning of an investigation that would uncover far darker details than anyone expected. Corvallis is a quiet small town in western Oregon, a typical suburb with identical semi-detached houses, manicured lawns, and narrow driveways where cars rarely drive. 712 Willow Lane is one of these addresses. The house is unassuming, one half rented to Eleanor Vance. According to official records, she is 27 years old and divorced. Formally, she is considered the sole adult resident of this semi-detached house. Living with her is Caleb Vance, the one she spoke about on the phone. The documents state that he is just over 2 years old, but in the files, he is only referred to by his first name. Neighbors describe this half of the duplex as ordinary. According to them, Eleanor led a reclusive life. She almost never went into the yard, rarely communicated, and shopped late in the evenings. The neighbor to the right, Mr. Henderson, a retiree, had only seen her a couple of times all summer. She had no guests from the street or regular visitors. Everything seemed commonplace, as if it were the story of a person trying to get her life back on track after a divorce. The house itself is not large. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, modest furniture, no renovation. On paper, an ordinary rental apartment. From a protocol perspective, the address is not considered problematic. The police had not been called there until this point. Child Protective Services recorded only one incident: the custody battle she lost against her ex-husband in early August, and the order to undergo a psychological evaluation. There are no other official warnings. In the files, this section is referred to as basic context. This is necessary to establish the starting point, and it is precisely this background that creates the contrast to what the officers found on site. The report clearly states only Eleanor is registered at the house. There are no other adult permanent residents. This fact automatically draws the investigators' attention to her not as a suspect, but as the sole eyewitness to the events. This is what the initial picture looks like: a quiet street, an inconspicuous house, formal data. But behind this facade lies a story that forced forensic experts to examine every detail, starting with the smells and traces noted in the first minutes of the inspection. When Detective Alistair Finch first spoke with Eleanor Vance, he expected to hear a standard story about what had happened during the night. He observed her carefully and asked simple questions. But the way she answered raised more doubts with each new detail. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table and began to speak calmly. The evening before, she had put Caleb to bed around 9 o'clock. She made sure he was asleep, turned off the light, and closed the bedroom door. Then, she said, she lay down herself, fell asleep almost immediately, and slept soundly all night. This was the first thing that struck Finch as strange. Normally, people in such a situation often admit that something disturbed them during the night. They woke up or heard something. But Eleanor was certain. Her sleep was deep. She had not woken up a single time. But then, as if recalling a minor detail, she added a strange particular. She said that at some point during the night, she seemed to have seen a dark figure. She pronounced the word "seemed" cautiously, as if she herself did not believe what she was saying. According to her, the figure was in the room next to Caleb, standing by the crib and not moving. She could not describe its height, face, or clothing. only a dark silhouette that then, according to her own words, simply disappeared. Finch tried to elicit at least some details, approximately what time it was, whether she had heard footsteps or a rustling, perhaps the sound of a door opening. But Eleanor kept repeating the same thing. "I'm not sure. I don't remember. I didn't hear anything." The officers who were already searching the house at that time found no signs of a forced entry. All windows were securely locked, the doors undamaged, the locks in perfect working order. Not even the slightest traces were found that could indicate the intrusion of an unfamiliar person. And this strengthened the suspicion, because, according to Eleanor's own account, it seemed as if someone had entered silently, taken Caleb, and left the house just as tracelessly. Finch noted in the report that the caller behaved surprisingly calmly, almost detached. Under normal circumstances, mothers in such situations lose their composure, cry, and demand that the missing person be found at all costs. But Eleanor sat quietly in the kitchen, simply repeating her version without any changes. At one point, she even asked if the interrogation would take much longer, as if she was not concerned about the incident, but about the necessity of answering questions. While Eleanor answered the detective, other police officers were already examining the backyard and the adjacent grounds. They immediately noticed that the ground in the backyard was thickly covered with chlorine, which almost completely obscured the usual footprints and all other possible traces. At first glance, it looked as if someone had very carefully, perhaps even hastily, tried to wash away or conceal something. This was immediately reported to the detective, and a flicker of suspicion, which he did not yet voice aloud, appeared in his eyes. Eleanor was asked again if she had recently used any cleaning agents in the yard, to which she quickly replied, "No." Her face did not change. Even after this question, she showed neither surprise nor concern. She just shook her head and looked silently away somewhere. After completing the initial questioning, Finch returned to his notes and wrote, "No physical traces of an unknown person's intrusion found." This sentence in the official report sounded almost like a verdict on Eleanor's original version, because it was exactly after this that the police stopped considering this case a usual disappearance. Now, it became clear to the detectives that the task was not to search for an unknown person who had entered the house from outside, but to find out what really happened inside the house during the night when Caleb disappeared. As the officers began to inspect the house, an unusual detail immediately caught their attention. Normally, after the disappearance of a loved one, a house is in disarray. People are nervous, hectic, turning things upside down in search of the missing person. Here, it was completely different. The house looked as if it had been carefully prepared for visitors. Everything in its place, the order was even somewhat strange given the circumstances. The police noted in the report that a pungent smell of chlorine was distinctly noticeable throughout the house. The smell was acrid and unpleasant. It seemed as if someone had spared no expense and tried to thoroughly clean literally every corner. This aroused suspicion among the officers. If a person disappears from the house, hardly anyone would think to first scrub the rooms with a strong chemical solution. Another strange moment occurred when the police went into the courtyard, where forensic technicians were already working. Here, a new smell emerged, faint but clearly recognizable as the smell of burnt flesh. In the context of Eleanor's story about a stranger who allegedly broke into the house at night, this seemed absolutely illogical. In the backyard, there was a small charcoal grill. One of the officers approached it and noticed an unusual detail. The grill grate had recently been cleaned, and there were almost no traces of food preparation left. The inner surface of the grill itself also looked recently and meticulously cleaned, which heightened the police's suspicion. When a forensic technician began to carefully examine the grill and opened its lower part, he noticed several small burnt pieces among the ashes that did not look like ordinary charcoal residue. He carefully removed them and examined them closely. They were small fragments resembling bones, heavily charred and blackened by fire. They were immediately packaged as separate evidence under number 4A. The discovery of these fragments immediately complicated the investigation and added new suspicions regarding Eleanor's version. The perfect cleanliness of the grill, the strange smells in the house, and the burnt particles did not fit her narrative. Investigators leaned towards the conclusion that something entirely different had happened, and the events of the night might have unfolded completely differently than the homeowner claimed. Meanwhile, Eleanor was still sitting in the kitchen, She showed no particular interest in the police's work and calmly looked out the window, as if she didn't notice what was happening in her yard. For Detective Finch, this was another reason to reconsider her initial statements. After the discovery of the fragments in the grill, the police completely dismissed the original version of an unknown person's intrusion. The task now was to find out exactly what Eleanor was trying to hide behind the mask of indifference and the meticulously maintained cleanliness in the house. After forensic experts discovered the strange burnt fragments in the grill in the backyard, the investigation had a new lead. And although Detective Finch did not rule out the possibility that Eleanor was somehow involved in the incident, he also had to check other possible versions. Because in cases of this kind, there is always someone who could benefit from the event. When the police checked Eleanor's personal data, it turned out that she had recently gone through a very difficult and painful divorce process. Her ex-husband, Daniel Vance, then 29 years old, had fought with her for custody of Caleb. The court documents the detective reviewed showed that the conflict between the spouses was intense and prolonged, and relations remained strained even after the official divorce. In court, Daniel had repeatedly stressed that he did not trust Eleanor, questioned her mental state, and insisted that he should care for Caleb. But the court had not ruled in his favor at that time. These circumstances aroused the detective's suspicion. In his experience, puzzling disappearances were sometimes caused precisely by such family conflicts. An ex-spouse who had lost the custody battle might try to turn the situation in their favor in such an extreme way, especially if doubts existed about the other parent's sanity. Finch examined the materials collected by the police at Daniel's residence. According to the records, Daniel lived separately in a small apartment closer to the center of Corvallis. He had no prior police record, no problems with the law, and was officially employed by a local construction company. His reputation among acquaintances and neighbors was quite good. Nevertheless, the family conflict, which had not gone in his favor just a few days earlier, made him a suitable candidate for a more thorough review. Additional information from court records showed that Daniel had reacted extremely emotionally to the court's decision shortly before Caleb's disappearance. During the last hearing, he openly told the judge that Eleanor was unable to care for Caleb and that, in his opinion, she posed a danger. The reports noted that he repeatedly emphasized his ex-wife's unstable mental state. Such statements were sometimes merely the result of anger and disappointment, but sometimes there was more hidden behind them. The police interviewed several friends and acquaintances of Daniel. Almost all confirmed that the divorce had severely affected his emotional state. Some of them recalled that he had expressed fear and anger in conversations, mentioning his ex-wife exclusively in a negative and highly emotional way. Others stated that he even seriously considered hiring a lawyer to challenge the court's decision again. Such statements clearly did not speak in his favor. These details led the police to consider his possible involvement in Caleb's disappearance. The fact is that the ex-husband was the only one who could theoretically have benefited from this situation. If the police had found incriminating evidence against Eleanor, Daniel would have had a strong argument to return to court and have the decision on Caleb's custody reviewed. Based on the information received, investigator Finch decided to officially add Daniel Vance to the list of persons of interest to the investigation. An order was immediately issued to ascertain his exact whereabouts on the night of the incident and in the subsequent hours. This was standard practice that would allow the police to either confirm or rule out his involvement in the events of that night. Now the investigation faced the task of checking Daniel's alibi. To do this, the police began to investigate his movements and contacts in the last 24 hours. In parallel, the detectives intended to re-interview Eleanor about her relationship with her ex-husband, hoping to obtain additional details that could shed light on the true reasons for the conflict and Caleb's disappearance. Thus, the investigation entered a new phase, and now, in addition to Eleanor herself, another person was at the center of police attention. And although there was no direct evidence against Daniel yet, the investigation had to carefully examine his version of events before proceeding. While police were investigating Daniel Vance's movements, Detective Finch decided to speak with the neighbors. From the beginning of the investigation, it was clear that Eleanor's statements could not be considered the only possible version of events. To clarify the situation, additional witnesses were needed who might have seen or heard something on the night of the incident. The first person to provide valuable statements to the police was the elderly neighbor Arthur Henderson. His house was directly across from Eleanor's duplex on the narrow Willow Lane. Henderson was already over 70 and spent most of his time at home, rarely going out in the evenings. The police routinely questioned him, not expecting any significant details from the elderly man, but Arthur immediately stated that the evening before, he had seen something that seemed unusual to him. According to Henderson, on the evening of August 12, around 10 o'clock, he was sitting in the living room watching television. At some point, he noticed through the window that something was happening in the backyard of house number 712. He saw no people but clearly observed smoke rising from the charcoal grill. This caught his attention because Eleanor normally never grilled and almost never spent time in the yard at all. Furthermore, it was late, already dark, and the time was unsuitable for typical outdoor food preparation. Henderson added that the smoke rose for quite a long time, which slightly unsettled him. According to him, the smell emanating from Eleanor's yard was strange. He chose his words carefully, saying it smelled like a normal barbecue, but at the same time, somehow wrong. He found it difficult to explain exactly why he had this impression. He only specified that the smell was sharper than usual and unpleasant, as if something else was burning, not just food. Detective Finch noted this in the report. These details were important to him because they directly contradicted Eleanor's words. According to her version, she had put Caleb to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening and immediately went to bed herself, not waking up until morning. She assured the police that she had not gotten up during the night, had not gone into the yard, and certainly had not cooked anything on the grill. The neighbor's statement, however, directly indicated that she had some activity during the night that she did not want to report to the police. After Henderson's testimony, investigators decided to return to the grill and examine it carefully again. They confirmed that the grill had indeed been recently used and thoroughly cleaned immediately after use. It remained unclear why Eleanor had not reported this immediately if she was innocent. Such an attempt to conceal minor details, which seemed to have no great significance, led the police to examine her behavior even more closely. Investigators also asked other neighbors if they had seen anything unusual that night. Some of those questioned confirmed Henderson's words about the smell, although they could not provide clear details. One neighbor even noted that it sounded less like food burning and more like burning plastic or something similar. These statements were recorded, and gradually a picture emerged for the investigators that clearly did not match the original story Eleanor had told. Detective Finch re-interviewed Eleanor, asking her questions about the nighttime activity in the yard. She responded with the same detachment, denying having left the house after putting Caleb to bed. According to her, she couldn't even imagine where the smoke the neighbor had seen could have come from. She spoke confidently and calmly, even too calmly, given the circumstances. But now, the witness's words had severely shaken the police's trust in her version of events. The statements of Henderson and other neighbors became a crucial turning point in the investigation. Thanks to their words, Eleanor's original version seemed less and less convincing, and investigators had a solid basis for a deeper investigation into what really happened in house number 712 on the night Caleb disappeared. The body cam footage of the officers clearly shows what the house and its owner looked like in the first minutes after the police arrived. The officers entered the kitchen, where they were greeted by Eleanor Vance. She sat at the table, not getting up to meet them. There was no phone or cups with unfinished tea on the table, only neatly folded documents and an empty surface. When the police introduced themselves and explained why they had come, she nodded briefly and remained seated, as if she had expected the visit in advance. The report states, "The subject asked no questions about the progress of the search, showed no concern, and took no initiative in the conversation." Normally, people in such situations try to call relatives or friends, seek support, ask officers for help. Here, there was none of that. Eleanor did not pick up the phone a single time while the police worked in the house. She did not try to call her ex-husband and did not ask when the search for Caleb would begin. All she did was sit and briefly answer the detective's questions. The footage shows that her posture was rigidly straight, hands on her knees, gaze lowered or fixed on a point on the table. When Finch asked her about the details of the night, she answered without changing her facial expression. Not a single tear, not a single sigh, as if the situation did not directly concern her. The forensic technicians noticed this and discussed among themselves that such behavior significantly deviated from the usual scenario. Even the most reserved people show fear in such circumstances. They start pacing the house, asking repeated questions, trying to get some information. Here, there was complete immobility. Finch noted in his records that his interviewee showed no signs of confusion or fear. She spoke clearly, but briefly, and offered no new information. At the same time, he saw that she heard everything happening around her. Her gaze occasionally drifted to the window, behind which the forensic technicians were working, but no reactions followed. According to departmental rules, in such cases, a crisis intervention specialist can be called to the scene. And so it happened. The psychologist who arrived did not conduct a full test, only an initial assessment of the condition. His report was later added to the files. It stated in black and white, "The subject shows signs of dissociative behavior. The reaction does not match the situation. Detachment and emotional flatness are observed." This characterization did not automatically make Eleanor guilty, but for the investigation, it was an important clue. Now, it was necessary not only to verify facts, but also to understand the psychological state of the woman at the center of this story. And, in the future, this line of investigation, the medical, not just the criminal, would play an increasingly significant role. When forensic technicians took the ash container from the grill and sent it to the Oregon State Laboratory, no one on the investigative team yet suspected what the final report would contain. Until this point, the case was formally handled as a disappearance, albeit with disturbing signs. Investigators had strange circumstances, contradictory statements, the anomalous behavior of the homeowner, but no evidence that Caleb was no longer alive. On August 16, 2019, 3 days after the yard inspection, Detective Finch received a package marked Express. It was the official report from the state laboratory. Several pages detailed the composition of the seized fragments. The specialists conducted a chemical and morphological analysis. Their conclusion sounded extremely concrete. The pieces found in the ash container are human bone remains that have been subjected to severe thermal treatment. The damage from the high temperature proved to be so severe that a complete DNA profile could not be extracted. The laboratory could only isolate a partial profile, which was sufficient for comparison, but not for a complete genetic passport. Nevertheless, this was enough to perform a match with reference samples. Forensic technicians had proactively secured Caleb's toothbrush from the bathroom as an admissible DNA source. The comparative analysis showed a 99.9% match. This meant only one thing: the fragments found in the grill belonged to Caleb. At this moment, the investigation ceased to be a search for a missing person. It became a criminal case for homicide. A new qualification appeared in the Files murder with subsequent disposal of remains. For Detective Finch, this report was the point of no return. All doubts the investigative team still had vanished. Eleanor's version of a nighttime abductor collapsed definitively. No stranger had taken Caleb from the house and moved his belongings somewhere. Everything happened in this yard under the guise of an ordinary suburban home. On the same day, after reviewing the report, the police issued a search warrant for the entire property, including outbuildings, attic, and garage. The goal of the investigation was now not only to collect evidence, but also to understand the motives. Forensic experts had to find out what drove Eleanor Vance to the actions she denied until the very end. This laboratory report became the turning point for the Willow Lane case. Until then, everything was based on contradictory words and indirect signs. Now, there was a piece of evidence that directly linked the found fragments to a specific person. And from this stage, the investigation moved into a phase where the main question for investigators was no longer the search, but the reconstruction of the events of that night to restore, step by step, what had happened in the house on the quiet suburban street. When the lab provided Finch with the preliminary DNA results, this was no longer enough for the investigation. An independent, complete report was needed that could not only confirm that the fragments belonged to Caleb, but also explain exactly what had been done to them. For this, a forensic pathologist with experience in severe thermal damage to bone tissue was brought in. The report that landed on the investigator's desk contained neither emotions nor conjectures, only numbers and facts. It meticulously analyzed the damage sustained by the found fragments and the conditions under which they could have occurred. The expert noted that the recovered pieces were too small and fragile for a complete reconstruction, but their size and structure provided important clues. The porosity and thickness of the bone tissue correspond to a person aged 1.5 to 2.5 years. This was a direct quote from the expert opinion. The age determination based on the bones made the abstract finding concrete. Then followed details that one could not read without a shudder. The expert described that the fragments were exposed to thermal effects at a temperature of over 650 degrees Celsius. Such an effect requires prolonged burning in an open fire or a closed chamber, but the traces pointed specifically to a household charcoal grill. He noted that the nature of the cracks and the charring tone indicated that the process had lasted not just a few minutes, but much longer. The report stated, "The degree of calcination of the bone, as well as the fragmentation of the material, indicates that the heat source was close and maintained for an extended period." This explained why investigators found no usual remains. Nothing whole was left of the original form, only individual charred pieces that had barely preserved their structure. The forensic expert also attached thermograms and photos of micro cracks to the report, proving that the heating occurred from the outside, not from the inside. For the investigation, this was an important signal. Everything happened in the backyard, under the control of a person who maintained the fire and monitored the process. The expert's opinion became the formal basis for reclassifying the case. Now, the police not only had a DNA match, but also an explanation for why no one could find Caleb whole. The remains were destroyed under conditions achievable in a normal household grill, but with prolonged and targeted exposure. This report allowed Detective Finch to move on to the next step: the collection of digital evidence that could show how and when Eleanor prepared for her actions. Now, investigators knew not only what had happened, but also how. The question of why remained. When detectives first began to check Eleanor's ex-husband, Daniel Vance, they could not overlook an obvious fact. Often it is ex-spouses who are involved in such incidents. The version seemed plausible and logical. Daniel was in a fierce conflict with Eleanor, had lost the custody battle, and openly expressed his dissatisfaction. All this combined to form a convincing picture, and the police decided to investigate his actions on the night of Caleb's disappearance as thoroughly as possible. During the first interrogation, Daniel behaved extremely emotionally, and at times, aggressively. He did not hide his dislike for his ex-wife, gesticulated, and raised his voice several times. The same thought resonated repeatedly in his statements, formulated with different nuances. "She was out of her mind. I often told people that she cannot be trusted. She is dangerous." He repeated these sentences almost continuously, as if he had prepared them in advance for the conversation with the police. At the time of the interrogation, he also said that he was not in the city at all on the night Caleb disappeared. According to his version, he had gone fishing with two friends at Detroit Lake, 70 miles from Corvallis. The police knew that such an alibi had to be carefully checked, especially in a case with such circumstances. They decided to immediately find out who these friends were and where Daniel really was. The check began with questioning the two men Daniel had named as his companions. Both confirmed that they were indeed with him on the lakeside all night. They said that they arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening, set up camp, and fished practically until morning. The police demanded evidence from them: photos, correspondence, store receipts. The men showed photos from their phone, in which Daniel, a campfire, tents, and the lake in the background were clearly visible. The creation time of the photos matched exactly the time when Caleb disappeared. However, this was not enough for the investigation. For complete certainty, the detectives requested location data from Daniel's phone. The mobile provider confirmed that his smartphone was in the Detroit Lake area on the specified night and did not leave this zone until morning. The cell tower data clearly showed that Daniel could not have been physically at the crime scene. This meant that his alibi was irrefutable. Although his behavior aroused suspicion, especially his aggressive manner of communication and his obvious hatred for his ex-wife, all evidence suggested that Daniel had nothing to do with Caleb's disappearance. He was angry, tense, and extremely worried about the events. But at the time of the crime, he was in a completely different place. After receiving all this data, Detective Finch was forced to officially release Daniel from suspect status. The version of the ex-husband, who could have avenged the lost custody of his wife in this way, turned out to be completely untenable. This became a major turning point for the investigation. The police could no longer doubt that only one person remained as the main suspect: Eleanor Vance herself. Now, the investigators had to return to where it all began, to the enigmatic behavior of the woman who showed no emotions, called no relatives, and was not interested in the results of the search. Daniel's ironclad alibi, though a disappointment for those hoping for a quick solution, brought the investigation back to the only version that had not yet been fully checked. This version required a detailed examination of all digital traces of Eleanor herself to understand what motives could be behind her actions and how carefully she had prepared for what happened. When investigators stopped considering Daniel as a figure who could explain Caleb's disappearance, all work focused on Eleanor. For Finch and his team, it was obvious. To understand what happened, one had to find out not only what she did on the night of the tragedy, but also what happened to her before. Only in the context of preceding events did her behavior begin to take shape. The first thing that caught the eye when investigating her past were the family court records. These documents showed that Eleanor's life in recent months had been a constant succession of stress. She lived in a rented duplex, worked part-time, and fought for custody of Caleb. On the 2nd of August, 2019, the court made a decision. Until the next hearing, Eleanor must undergo a psychological evaluation. For her, this was a blow, because in the eyes of Child Protective Services, it looked like a doubt about her sanity. Finch carefully examined this section of the case. Letters from Daniel's lawyer were also attached to the court records, directly questioning her mental state. Eleanor reacted sharply at the hearing, raised her voice several times, and behaved, as noted in the protocol, emotionally unstable. Formally, this could not be a reason to deprive her of her rights to Caleb, but in conjunction with other details, it undermined her position. The next step was to examine her financial and pharmacy data. The police obtained a warrant for access to this data and soon discovered a disturbing detail. On the 9th of August, a few days before Caleb's disappearance, Eleanor bought a strong over-the-counter sleeping pill at a pharmacy. The purchase was made in her name, the receipt was preserved. Experts clarified that this medication, if overdosed, can cause a deep and sometimes irreversible sleep. This information radically changed the perception of the situation. Until this moment, Eleanor had tried to stick to the version of the nocturnal kidnapper, the dark figure at the bed. But the judicial pressure and the purchase of a medication that could be used not only for sleeping, but also to incapacitate a person, formed a consistent chain. The judicial defeat, the order for evaluation, the purchase of the sleeping pill, and then Caleb's disappearance. In the investigation reports, this sequence was called a situation suggesting planning. No one directly wrote the word premeditation, but for experienced investigators, the outline of the picture was obvious. It did not look like an accident or a sudden breakdown, but like preparation for an act that Eleanor carefully concealed under the everyday routine. When examining correspondence and search queries on her phone, criminalists found even more disturbing signs. Queries about dosages, bone-burning temperature, how to cover up the smell of burnt flesh. All of this dated to the last week before Caleb's disappearance. Each new detail left no room for the investigation to consider the version of an accident. Thus, investigators received the first complete picture, not only the night of the tragedy, but also its preparatory phase. Everything indicated that what happened was not sudden, and from that moment on, the main task of the investigation was not just to prove Eleanor's guilt, but to understand what was going on in her head in those days and who, if anyone, could have noticed the signs of the impending nightmare. At the Benton County Sheriff's Office, a separate office was prepared for Eleanor Vance. Not a basement with a lamp over her head, as in movies, but an ordinary interrogation room, a table, 2 chairs, a camera in the corner. On the table, a folder with the case files. On the wall, Detective Finch and a representative of the prosecution. By this time, the investigation had coalesced into a single, dense whole. No hints, no conjectures, but facts that could not be ignored. Finch began the interrogation without much preamble. He spoke measuredly, in a calm voice, but every word cut into the silence. First, he read excerpts from Arthur Henderson's statements about the smoke in the yard, about the smell that did not smell like ordinary food preparation. The neighbors' statements were recorded, signed, and confirmed by other residents of the street. After that, he placed photos of the grill and the ash container on the table. Crime scene photos, close-ups of the charred fragments, the marking of the evidence. Finch emphasized that these findings matched Caleb's DNA profile, which criminalists had obtained from his toothbrush. He said this softly, like a dry statement, but the sentence itself hung in the air, transforming the interrogation room into a place where there was no longer any escape. Then followed the documents regarding the pharmacy purchase. the receipt for a strong sleeping pill from the 9th of August, a certificate stating that the medication causes a deep and prolonged sleep in high doses, an excerpt from the court, records with the demand to conduct a psychological evaluation. All of this combined into a single line: pressure, purchase, Caleb's disappearance, the found fragments. To every point Finch made, Eleanor answered the same. I don't know. Sometimes, I don't remember. Sometimes, silence. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, not lifting her gaze. The camera in the corner recorded every moment. The recording shows the detective leaning forward to catch her gaze, but she remains motionless. Finch continued. No signs of forced entry, fresh chlorine in the house, the clean grill grate, no phone calls on the night of the crime. The evidence piled up, forming a wall behind which there was no room for coincidence. Even the experienced investigator felt the room fill with heavy silence. Eleanor did not justify herself, did not scream, did not try to flee. She did not deny the facts, but she also did not try to explain them. She sat with the same motionless detachment as on the morning of the police's arrival. When the detective asked another question about the medication, she only raised her eyes and said, "I want a lawyer." That was the point where the interrogation came to a standstill. Finch closed the folder and signaled the camera to turn off. The prosecutor silently collected his papers. An official indictment had not yet been filed, but after this meeting, investigators knew, now they no longer had to ask questions, but to prepare a complete package of evidence for the court. From this moment on, the investigation entered a new phase, not the search for facts, they had already been collected, but the work on drafting the indictment and searching for what could definitively pinpoint Eleanor's motive and explain what had driven her to the actions she refused to comment on. Investigators understood that Eleanor Vance's silence during interrogations was not in itself a confession. Not words, but facts that could not be denied, were needed. The last chance to find such facts was offered by analyzing her digital footprint. The cybercrime department team joined the case and gained access to backups of Eleanor's smartphone and her home laptop. In the report that landed on Detective Finch's desk, there was no rhetoric or conjecture, just a list of search queries, dates, and times. And this list proved to be the strongest evidence. Specialists reconstructed the search history for the period from the 5th to the 12th of August, 2019, exactly the week preceding Caleb's disappearance. The first line, 5th of August, strong over-the-counter sleeping pill. Next date, 7th of August, dosage for deep sleep in a 2-year-old. A day later, how quickly does respiratory arrest occur after overdose? Then followed increasingly terrifying formulations. 9th of August, burning temperature of human bones. 10th of August, how to get rid of the smell of burnt flesh in the house. 11th of August, chlorine as a means to cover up traces. Each of these queries was recorded with time and IP address, which matched Eleanor's home network. Furthermore, bookmarks with the same articles were saved on the phone. Cyber specialists even recovered deleted entries. The browser history had been deleted one day before the call to the police, but copies had been preserved in the cloud backup. Finch read the report slowly, like an indictment protocol. These queries not only showed the fact of preparation, they showed the process of thinking, searching, choosing methods. It was not an impulsive act, but a consistent investigation of the topic, step by step. At this point, the police no longer had any gaps. They had witness statements, the results of DNA analysis, pharmacy data, and now, a digital chronicle in which Eleanor had documented her path herself. Every new line in the cybercrime department's report made her version of the dark figure increasingly absurd. For the investigators, it was checkmate. Now, one could not only talk about the events of that night, but also show how one had prepared for them. This evidence shifted the case to a stage where only one question remained. Not who was guilty, but how to put all these facts together into an indictment so that the court heard them in the same order in which the investigators had collected them. A few days after the interrogation, which had reached a dead end, Eleanor Vance agreed to make a new statement. Formally, this happened at the initiative of her lawyer. They spent several hours alone, and then Eleanor herself asked for a meeting with Detective Finch. She was brought to the office without handcuffs, but with a guard. This time, the woman looked different, her hair tied in a messy bun, her gaze tired, her hands trembling. The recording of this conversation is preserved in the case files. In the first few minutes, one can hear Eleanor breathing irregularly, trying to start but faltering. She does not answer specific questions. Instead, she begins to speak on her own, as if she needs to say it out loud. Her previous monotonous tone was replaced by hesitant speech, with long pauses, sudden sighs. In the interrogation protocol, this is reproduced in dry lines, but the meaning of the words themselves sounded like a cold blow. The voices said he had to be purified by fire to save him. She said this not like someone justifying herself, but like someone describing an inner reality, convinced that it was true. It continued. She recounted that for several nights in a row, she had heard whispers, convincing her that Caleb was possessed by evil and his soul needed to be freed. These confessions contained no details that could have been verified, no names, no concrete descriptions. But they matched what the investigators already knew. The chronology, the purchase of the medication, the grill, all of this Eleanor indirectly confirmed by telling her version. She did not deny the facts, but interpreted them as ritual, as salvation. Finch did not interrupt her at this moment. The recording shows him listening without asking questions. This was not a standard interrogation, but a kind of confession. The prosecutor was present, but also remained silent. Every new word from Eleanor became a building block in the indictment, but at the same time revealed itself as testimony to a deep psychological deformation. At the end of this conversation, she no longer clung to the old story of the nocturnal kidnapper. Her confession is recorded in the protocol. I gave him the medication myself. I carried him into the yard myself. The voices said it had to be this way. This sentence became the key to the entire case, not only as evidence, but also as an explanation for a motive that proved far more terrible than simple revenge or despair. From this moment on, investigators no longer doubted who had committed the crime. But now the court faced another question. Not what happened, but in what state Eleanor was when she made her decisions. And this question was no longer for Detective Finch to decide, but for a jury and summoned experts. After Eleanor's confession, investigators were able to piece together all the scattered elements into a single chronology. This reconstruction left no room for speculation. Every action was confirmed by evidence, witness statements, and digital data. On the evening of the 12th of August, around 21 o'clock, Eleanor prepared juice for Caleb, in which she had previously dissolved the medication purchased on the 9th of August. She waited until he had drunk it and sent him to bed. According to experts, the dosage was calculated to put him into a deep sleep from which he could not wake up. This was the first crucial step. It matches the data on the purchase of the medication and the search queries. After that, her actions became increasingly methodical. When Caleb stopped breathing, Eleanor, according to her own words, wrapped him in a blanket and carried him into the backyard. She lit the charcoal grill that had been prepared in advance. Investigators found that the charcoal and lighter fluid had been purchased on the same day. The store receipts were preserved. In her confession, the sentence sounded that the voices said to purify him with fire. But in practice, it looked like a gradual preparation, maintaining the fire, moving the grate, controlling the process. According to the statements of neighbor Arthur Henderson, around 22 o'clock, dense smoke rose from Eleanor's yard, the smell of which was flesh-like, but wrong. At this time, according to the investigators' reconstruction, the burning of the remains took place. The temperature was high enough to reduce the bones to fragile fragments within a few hours. The forensic expert confirmed exactly this type of damage was found on the recovered pieces. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, Eleanor, as analyses of air samples and traces on her clothes showed, began cleaning. She cleaned the grill, washed the grate, treated the yard with chlorine to cover up the smell. This explains the pungent chemical background that the police smelled during the first inspection of the house. In the morning, around 7:30, she called 911 and calmly reported Caleb's disappearance. This reconstruction matched her confession down to the smallest detail. The pharmacy purchase, on the 9th of August, the search queries, from the 5th to the 12th, the smoke in the yard, on the evening of the 12th of August, the call to 911, on the morning of the 13th of August. All of this combined into a cold-blooded, terrifyingly clear sequence. For the investigators, this picture became the final confirmation. Not only the confession, but also material evidence, digital traces, witnesses, and expert opinions combined into a single story in which no gaps remained. Now, the case could move into the phase where Eleanor Vance's fate would be decided by the court and a psychiatric evaluation. In court, the prosecution no longer had to prove the act itself. The evidence spoke for itself. The main question now was what sentence could be just in such a situation. Eleanor's lawyer presented the reports of 3 independent psychiatrists. The diagnosis read in the courtroom made many present shudder: acute postpartum psychosis with pronounced delusional components. Experts confirmed that Eleanor was unable to control herself and recognized the reality of what was happening at the time of the actions she was accused of. After long sessions and heated debates, the jury retired to deliberate. Finally, the judge announced the verdict, which sounded clear and emotionless. Eleanor Vance is found guilty, but legally insane at the time of the act. A lifelong involuntary commitment for treatment in a specialized closed facility is ordered. The courtroom fell silent. Such a decision proved to be legally correct, but morally controversial. It was not a judgment in the classical sense. It was the recognition that Eleanor had committed the crime not out of malice, but due to a severe mental illness. The court decision was not only the end of a sensational case, but also a mirror of the complex and uncomfortable question of where the line between crime and illness lies. Now, the investigators could only try to understand whether this could have been prevented. After the verdict, Eleanor Vance was transferred to the Oregon State Hospital, a psychiatric facility where she was to spend the rest of her life under strict medical supervision. Daniel Vance, the ex-husband, did not accept what happened silently. He filed a civil lawsuit against the social services of Benton County. In his lawsuit, he claimed that the system had ignored the obvious signals about Eleanor's mental state and essentially allowed the tragedy to happen. The house on Willow Lane was quickly sold, and soon new residents moved in, unaware of what had happened. After a few months, the case itself was hardly reported in local newspapers anymore. It remained only as a dry document in the archives of the Benton County Police. But for those involved in the investigation, the case was never just reduced to numbers and data. Behind closed doors, investigators repeatedly returned to one thought. At all stages of the case, in court, with Child Protective Services, with social services, there were people who saw that something was wrong with Eleanor. There were complaints, letters, calls, but no one took decisive action in time. This case proved to be not just the story of a terrible crime. It forced one to think about deeper things, about how often we close our eyes to the problems of others until it is too late. This question is not in the investigation files and court records, but it is precisely this question that hangs in the air and gives no peace to anyone who knows this story. Darkhan, summer of 2023. On a regular workday, an entry appears at the police station, no different from dozens of others. The log records: complaint about an odor received from residents of an apartment building, reason for call, pipe repair. The wording is dry and extremely mundane. These are typical calls received almost every day. A riser burst, sewage accumulated, it's impossible to breathe on the stairwell. No one even suspects that behind this entry lies the beginning of one of the most difficult stories of recent years. The duty squad receives the address, a standard 5-story Soviet-era building. The house stands in a residential area of Darkhan. Neighbors clarify upon meeting. The smell has been present for several days, but today it intensified so much that it became impossible to stay in the stairwell. The clarification is recorded in the report. 2 policemen go upstairs. Already from the stairs, they understand. The complaint is justified. The smell is indeed strong, dense, and barely tolerable. Its source is obvious: one specific apartment. According to instructions, the officers are obligated to ensure that everything is in order inside, and if necessary, call utility services. A knock on the door, footsteps beyond the threshold. A man opens the door, the apartment owner. At first glance, no violations, furniture in place, lights on, order. But the smell inside is even stronger than in the stairwell. The police note details. It comes not from the kitchen or the bathroom, but from a closed room. The door to it is tightly shut. According to the protocol, they ask the owner to open the room. He stalls, citing that it's a storage for things. But there is no refusal. The door is opened anyway. the scene inside immediately changes the nature of the visit. A massive bundle stands on the floor, several layers of fabric, tightly wound, the edges tied with ropes. The surface of the bundle is sprinkled with a powdery substance. By color and structure, experts later determine it is a mixture of salt and lime. The use of precisely these materials cannot be attributed to chance. This is a method known to those who try to stop processes occurring with organic matter. Understanding the scale of the find, the officers call forensic experts. They arrive in half an hour. The examination is conducted according to the rules. Every step is recorded. Photo and video shooting are included. Specialists carefully begin to open the bundle. First, they cut the outer fabric, then remove layer by layer. Each movement is accompanied by a timestamp and description. The bundle is bulky, clearly not processed for storing things. With each passing minute, it becomes more obvious. Something non-domestic is hidden inside. And finally, the find is officially confirmed. Mummified human remains are discovered inside the bundle. The examination report indicates it is an adult human, but neither the gender, nor the identity, nor the cause of death can be established at this moment. Further examination will be required for this. The owner is present in the apartment. His reaction and behavior are also recorded. Officers note that he is nearby, does not try to hide, but also shows no natural interest or concern. In such cases, every small detail becomes part of the picture. The initial examination concludes with a key finding. The case cannot be considered a domestic incident. The complaint about the smell is officially closed. Now, it is a fact of discovering human remains and grounds for initiating a criminal case for possible murder. From this moment, a full-fledged investigation begins. And the first question that the investigation needs to answer sounds extremely simple. To whom does the apartment where the find was made belong, and who might be connected to the discovered bundle? The Batterden family never stood out among other residents of their high-rise building in Darkhan. They were the most ordinary people. The head of the family, Namjil, at that time 48 years old, worked without much fanfare, did not seek wide recognition, and did not maintain active social connections. His wife, Aisu, several years his junior, managed the usual household. They had 2 adult children who had long since moved to the capital, Ulaanbaatar, so only the spouses remained in the apartment permanently. This detail would later become key, but at that time, no one paid attention to it. Looking through the eyes of the neighbors, there was nothing alarming in their lives. In the testimonies given later, the same words were repeated: calm, reserved, ordinary. People knew them only in a domestic context. They saw them in the stairwell, sometimes met them in the yard, but no close contacts developed. The spouses did not host noisy parties, did not quarrel, did not conflict with neighbors, and never called the police. The housing management also had no complaints about them. In essence, the Batterdeen family appeared completely inconspicuous. There are hundreds of such families. They quietly pay for utilities, clean the area on time, and try not to interfere in others' lives. For those around them, it was even a kind of guarantee of stability. In high-rise buildings, there are always several such apartments. Their residents hardly participate in the life of the yard, but at the same time, they never cause problems. That is why the name Bat Erdeni never appeared in police reports or lists of complaints from residents until 2023. Their entire description fit into a couple of short words, and this only intensified the contrast with what happened later. However, the picture of calm cracked in 2019. This year became the point after which the family's life ceased to be ordinary. It was then that Aisu stopped appearing in her usual places. Neighbors no longer saw her near the entrance, in the yard, or even fleetingly in the window. Relatives also noted that meetings and calls stopped. There were no visits, no usual conversations. Everything ended unexpectedly. Over time, Aisu's absence stopped being noticeable. Namjil assured acquaintances that his wife had gone to visit relatives. He showed rare messages from her name on social networks. Overall, this seemed plausible, as people sometimes do. Go away for a long time, but details, dates, places, explanations never appeared. For those around them, it remained a closed topic. The fact, later recorded in the case materials, sounds dry. Aisu disappeared from the public eye exactly in 2019. Since then, no one has seen her in person. For 4 years, her absence remained hidden under her husband's explanations and under formal messages on the internet. And it is this line, a calm family that suddenly lost one of its members and continued to live as if nothing had happened, that will become a key contradiction in the subsequent investigation. Thus, the picture of a normal family fell apart. In place of a quiet and inconspicuous cell of society, investigators encountered a story where everything turned out to be built on concealment and deception. And at this stage, it became clear what seemed like ordinary life was just a facade. Behind it lay what ultimately led to the most high-profile case of recent years in Darkhan. When Aisu stopped appearing in the house and yard, the attention of neighbors and acquaintances immediately shifted to her husband. In their home, he always seemed to be the main one, the person who kept all household matters in his hands. And he became the one who gave explanations when questions began to be asked about why Aisu had not been seen for a long time. Namjil always had the same answer. She went to relatives. The answer was calm, emotionless, uttered as if it were a routine matter that did not require additional details. In these words, there was no specificity, no date, no place, only a general formulation. But even this was enough. At first, no one asked clarifying questions. People accepted the version as given, and gradually it turned into unofficial truth, a convenient explanation for everyone. To maintain this legend, Namjil took another step. He showed correspondence on social networks. Messages came from Aisu's account. Their content boiled down to monotonous short phrases. "I'm fine, don't worry, I'll be back soon." These messages looked like perfunctory replies, without personal details, without her characteristic words or usual greetings. But close relatives did not attach importance to this. The main thing was that answers were coming from the account, meaning the person was in touch. This is how many explained what was happening to themselves. And although in normal circumstances this could have aroused suspicion, here the trust of relatives played a role. The correspondence solved several tasks at once. It calmed the children who wanted to know how their mother was living. It convinced distant relatives that Aisu was fine. And it protected Namjil from unnecessary questions from neighbors. Everyone saw confirmation on the phone screen and considered the situation clear. No one checked which device these messages were coming from. No one wondered why, in 4 years, there had not been a single video call, not a single photo taken in a new place. It seemed that everyday excuses, being busy, poor connection, tiredness, overshadowed all doubts. Relatives were used to trusting. And it was this trust that became Namjil's key tool. He did not invent complex stories, did not build long explanations. A couple of phrases, spoken in a calm voice, and a couple of short messages were enough for him to maintain control. Even when someone casually noted the strangeness in the fact that contact was limited only to texts, the husband always found a simple excuse. He would say, "The connection is bad there," or "She can't talk right now, she's busy." And that was enough to close the conversation. The main thing that worked in his favor was the absence of an official appeal. The police always start searching only after someone files a missing person report. But in this case, there was no report. Neither the husband, nor the children, nor the relatives went to the police. Formally, for the authorities, it looked as if Aisu was simply living somewhere else, and her family knew exactly where. This became the loophole that allowed the truth to be hidden for many years. When the case reached the investigation, this fact was recorded in the materials as one of the key details. The documents dryly stated, Aisu Bat Erdene was never listed as missing. For 4 years, her absence was never officially registered as a problem. On paper, she existed as an ordinary person who, for some reason, did not appear in one city but lived somewhere else, and this played against her. Thus, a simple legend built on short answers and one general phrase from the husband allowed the reality to be hidden for 4 years. Neighbors stopped asking questions, relatives stopped worrying, the police had no formal reason to intervene, and only a random check in 2023 shattered this artificially created picture. From this moment, the story ceased to be a narrative about a missing wife and turned into an investigation where real circumstances and new facts that could no longer be ignored came to the forefront. When the police handed the discovery over to experts, the investigation immediately moved to a new level. Forensic medical examination in such cases always becomes the central element. It provides answers to questions that neither neighbors, nor relatives, nor even the apartment owner can answer. In the morgue, the bundle was carefully opened. Specialists step by step recorded every detail: the condition of the tissues, traces of substance treatment, signs of the time elapsed since death. All actions were carried out strictly according to protocol, so that later there would be no doubt about the reliability of the conclusions. Initially, experts visually examined the remains, noted the peculiarities of the dentition, and immediately made an inquiry to the city polyclinic where Aisu had been observed over the years. Records of dental treatment were preserved there. In parallel, a DNA test was ordered. Investigators took samples from her relatives, from children, and close family members. Genetic analysis was performed in the laboratory, and the results matched perfectly. There could be no mistake. The found remains belonged precisely to Asubat Erdane. This news finally shattered the illusion of her trip to relatives. In one moment, all of Namjil's conversations and assurances turned into empty words. Now the police had not guesses, but a confirmed fact. The woman who was thought to have left in 2019 had been in the house all this time. The next step was to ascertain the cause of death. Forensic experts thoroughly examined the skull, bones, and preserved tissues. They found characteristic damage in the head area, which could only have resulted from a strong blow with a heavy object. This was not the consequence of an accidental fall or illness. The injury was sustained while alive and incompatible with further life. The experts' conclusion clearly stated, the cause of death was a blow to the head with a blunt object. The degree of tissue destruction allowed for an approximate determination of the time elapsed, about 4 years. This period completely coincided with the moment of her disappearance. Thus, the version that Aisu had simply left and maintained no contact due to poor connection or being busy completely lost its meaning. The forensic examination showed that she died at approximately the same time she disappeared. Now the investigation had a key fact: the death was violent. In parallel with the examination, a search was conducted in the apartment. Each room was thoroughly investigated, recording even minor details. Wardrobes, shelves, personal belongings, old boxes were examined. Special attention was paid to items that might have belonged to Aisu. And it was during these actions that the most important piece of evidence was found: her phone. The device lay in a drawer among papers and unnecessary items. Outwardly, it appeared intact, but the battery was completely dead. When specialists recovered the data, it turned out the phone's last activity was dated 2019. After this date, there were no calls, no messages, no network connections. This discovery was decisive. If the husband's version was to be believed, Aisu had left to visit relatives and had been living separately all this time. But then an obvious fact arises. A person does not leave without a phone, especially in our time. It is impossible to imagine that she would have left it at home and not used it for all subsequent years. An official check confirmed the phone never left the apartment. This meant that Yasu also never left it. Now the investigation had 3 weighty facts in hand: confirmed identification of the remains, a conclusion of violent death, and evidence in the form of a phone left at home. All these circumstances pointed to the falsity of Namjil's version. He spoke of a trip and correspondence, but the examination showed the correspondence was conducted from a device located in his home, and the owner of that device could no longer conduct it. Thus, the case officially transitioned from a missing person category to a murder investigation. This was a fundamentally new direction. The police had to establish who and under what circumstances inflicted the fatal blow, and how, for 4 years, the family and neighbors remained completely unaware. The investigation's attention now focused on one person, Aisu's husband, who had lived all this time alongside the hidden secret. When the work of forensic experts confirmed the identity of the found remains and established that it was indeed Aisu Bat Erdani, the investigation took the first decisive step. From that moment, the operatives had no doubt. The main and only person who could have been involved in her disappearance and what happened in the apartment was her husband, Namjil. His procedural status officially changed. If earlier he was a witness and the owner of the dwelling where investigative actions were carried out, now he became the main suspect. The moment of arrest itself was also formalized according to the letter of the law. Operatives presented a warrant, explained his rights, and informed him on what grounds he was detained. After that, he was handcuffed and taken to the station. For the investigation, this was a transitional event. The man who for 4 years had feigned a normal life and assured everyone around him that his wife was alive and away was now officially at the center of a criminal case. The interrogation began in a standard setting: an office, the presence of an investigator, a secretary, and witnesses. Every word was recorded in the protocol. First, Namjil was notified of the examination results. The investigator stated directly that experts had confirmed the identity of the deceased. For any person, such information would be a shock. Usually, at this moment, strong reactions are recorded: crying, shouting, denial, emotional breakdowns. But in this case, the opposite was recorded in the protocol. He showed no emotions, his face remained calm, his reaction was restrained, almost indifferent. This lack of emotion in itself became a detail that raised serious questions. Then he was given the opportunity to explain himself. The investigator asked a direct question: how to explain that his wife, who allegedly left in 2019, had been in his apartment all this time. Namjil repeated the same phrase he had told neighbors and relatives: she left. But now, concrete facts, confirmed by the examination, lay against him. There was no logic or persuasiveness in his words. When asked to clarify how his wife could leave and yet be found in the room where she was discovered, he remained silent. The protocol noted, refused to answer. His silence was more eloquent than any words. After this, the investigator presented another piece of evidence. Aisu's phone, found during the search, was placed on the table. The question was direct: if she really left and wrote messages from afar, how to explain that her phone had been in the house for all 4 years? Namjil again tried to wriggle out. His answer was short: she forgot it. But this version also did not stand up to scrutiny. Experts analyzed the device. It was established that it was used to send messages to children and relatives. Localization showed. In all these years, the phone never left the apartment. Its signals were recorded exclusively at the place of residence. Thus, one piece of evidence after another destroyed his legend. The first contradiction: the found remains. The second: the phone. The third: the absence of calls and personal contacts for 4 years. Each new fact made his explanations more and more untenable. Investigators recorded, Namjil's words contradict the examination results, and his versions are not supported by any data. In the end, the interrogation concluded with the Oformlinea processing of arrest documents. His status was finally confirmed. He was now a suspect in the concealment and possible murder of his wife. He was transferred to a temporary detention facility. For the investigation, this meant the beginning of a new stage. It was necessary to reconstruct the entire chronology of events, understand how he had hidden the truth all these years, and gather evidence for court. The story of the disappearance turned into a criminal case with a specific accused. Everything that previously seemed like a version or rumors was now confirmed by documents and evidence. Investigators moved to the next step, checking all the details of his life during these 4 years and gathering testimonies from close ones. This was supposed to finally show how he managed to maintain the illusion of a normal family for so long. The investigators approached the case systematically. It was necessary not only to record the fact of the discovery in the apartment, but also to prove in detail that Aisu could not have led an independent life after 2019. To do this, everything was checked, from bank accounts to her digital footprint. Every little detail mattered because it is from the details that the whole picture is formed. The first step was official inquiries to banks and credit organizations. Everything was of interest: salary receipts, social benefits, cash withdrawals, purchases in stores, even small transfers through ATMs. The answers came quickly and showed an astonishing picture. The last activity was recorded in the summer of 2019. After that, a complete absence of any transactions. Accounts remained open, cards valid, but they simply were not used. For an ordinary person, this seemed illogical. Even if Aisu lived modestly, money would still be needed for food, transport, medicine. Complete silence in the banks meant that her financial life was cut short at one moment. The next stage was to examine her contacts. First, official calls and messages were checked. Communication operators provided detailed billing. A clear boundary was traced there. After mid-2019, all calls disappeared. There was only rare correspondence, and exclusively by text. Not a single voice call. For a person who always actively maintained contact with loved ones, this seemed unnatural. In parallel, her children were summoned for an interview. They confirmed they had not spoken directly to their mother once in 4 years. All contacts were limited to messages and instant messengers. Moreover, these messages looked suspiciously similar. There was no usual warmth, no details about life, no personal expressions, only dry phrases. "I'm fine, I'll be back soon. Don't worry." For the children themselves, this seemed strange at the time, but their father assured them that everything was fine. When they tried to ask why their mother wasn't calling, Namjil always answered the same way. "She has a bad connection there." Sometimes he would add that she had an old phone, or it's inconvenient to talk by voice. These explanations sounded plausible, but only until the investigation checked her digital devices. Cybersecurity experts meticulously examined Aisu's accounts. They checked social networks, instant messengers, and email. It turned out that all logins to her accounts occurred from one IP address, the Bat Erdine family's home internet. The location never changed, even when the correspondence allegedly stated that she was somewhere else. Additional analysis showed messages were sent from a phone that had been at home all this time. This became the turning point. The phone, which according to the husband's version should have been with her somewhere, actually never left the apartment. Moreover, when experts recovered the data, it turned out that from mid-2019, the device was not used for its direct purpose at all. No calls were made, the camera was not turned on, not even alarms were set. It functioned only as a tool for correspondence. All this allowed the investigation to assemble a unified picture. Aisu's financial life stopped in 2019. There was no more voice communication with her children. The phone remained at home and was used to simulate her presence. The messages she supposedly wrote were cold and impersonal. Everything indicated that only one person had access to the accounts and devices, Namjil. In their reports, experts formulated this extremely clearly. The date of her digital disappearance coincided with mid-2019. After this mark, Aisu as an independent person ceased to exist in the information field. Everything that appeared in her name was controlled and generated by another person. This conclusion became key evidence that the "she left" version was completely fabricated. Thus, the investigation was able not only to debunk the husband's legend, but also to pinpoint the exact moment when Aisu's life effectively ended. And now, the logical next step was to understand how Namjil managed to hide the truth for 4 years. After 2019, the usual way of life in that apartment changed beyond recognition. Neighbors noted that Namjil began to behave as if he was consciously isolating himself from the outside world. If before he might go out into the yard, talk to neighbors about everyday things, linger by the entrance, and exchange a few words about communal issues, such contacts gradually dwindled to almost nothing. He was no longer seen in common areas, he appeared on the street less and less, and did not participate in the life of the building. Many recalled that even when they met, he would limit himself to short nods and try to end the conversation as quickly as possible. What was particularly alarming was how he handled visits from outsiders. For scheduled inspections, whether by plumbers, electricians, or management company employees, the doors remained closed. To requests to inspect equipment, he would refuse and always explain the same thing: "I'll do everything myself." Outwardly, this might have seemed like a display of independence, a habit of managing without help. But as the situation repeated itself again and again, it gave the impression that his goal was not to repair things himself, but to prevent anyone from entering the apartment. When relatives visited, the picture became even more telling. He would meet them at the door, in the hallway, and always created the impression of being in a hurry. In rare cases, he would allow them into the kitchen, where they could sit and talk, but access to the back rooms remained closed. The doors there were always locked or ajar, and even close relatives could not see what was behind them. To direct questions about his wife, he would give identical, seemingly rehearsed phrases. "She's sleeping," "she went to the store," "in the bathroom." Not a single answer was specific. Not once did he offer to call her or show where she was. At first, this was accepted as a minor oddity, but repeating year after year, it became clear that such explanations no longer seemed plausible. Investigators specifically examined how he maintained the illusion of her presence. And here, another important detail emerged. In nearby stores, Namgil was well remembered. He regularly bought items that clearly belonged to his wife. These included personal hygiene products, sometimes even new clothes. At the checkout, his purchases did not raise questions. It looked as if he was simply taking care of his wife, who was either busy or temporarily absent. Moreover, he did not hide these purchases. In conversations with his children or relatives, he would mention them as proof that Aisu continued to be a part of their daily life. To an outside observer, this could serve as confirmation that the woman was indeed somewhere, just not appearing in plain sight. Gradually, an entire system became apparent. His reclusiveness, refusal to let anyone into the apartment, monotonous answers to questions about his wife, and the display of purchases. All of this formed a coherent picture. Namgil consciously created the illusion that normal life continued in the house, while the key figure in that life had long been gone. Every one of his actions had a purpose: to maintain this false facade, not allowing anyone to doubt his words. For the investigation, this became a crucial turning point. It was now clear. What neighbors simply called strange behavior was actually a consistent and systematic concealment of the truth. He constructed it not spontaneously, not on a whim, but over years, step by step, testing how far he could go. And it was this carefully planned scheme that allowed him to maintain the appearance of normalcy for 4 years. All the collected facts finally confirmed. This was not about domestic habits or personal eccentricities. This was deliberate behavior, indicating cold-blooded and long-term concealment. For the investigation, there was one next step: to understand exactly how he managed to maintain this lie for so long, and what details inside the apartment could shed light on what had been happening all this time. After the first procedural measures, the investigators understood. A superficial inspection of the apartment would not be enough. Material evidence that could directly point to the circumstances of what happened had to be somewhere inside the premises. It was decided to organize a repeated search, but this time with the involvement of specialists and the use of technical means. The plan was simple: check every corner of the apartment, dismantle all possible structures, and rule out any possibility that hidden evidence might remain inside. The search began early in the morning. Forensic experts, operatives, and witnesses arrived at the scene. They drew up a detailed work plan so as not to miss anything. They started with the living room. There, they carefully examined the furniture, books, and items on the shelves. Then they moved to the bedroom. Special attention was paid to the floor, walls, and ventilation shafts. They used special probes, ultraviolet lamps, thermal imagers, everything that could help detect voids or anomalies. They even checked pipes and sockets, recording every step in the protocol. The work was slow. It seemed that the apartment was empty and had not been renovated for a long time. Furniture stood in its places, dust covered the corners, no traces of interference were found. But it is in such situations that attention to detail becomes crucial. And after several hours of searching, forensic experts noticed one detail. A floorboard in the far room did not fit as tightly as the others. With a slight press, it gave way and sagged slightly. At first, this could be attributed to ordinary wear and tear, but checks showed the board moved too easily. The floorboard was carefully lifted. A small niche was found underneath it. The size was such that items could be hidden there without arousing suspicion from a casual visitor. Inside was a plastic bag. It was immediately photographed, after which it was removed and unfolded. The first thing that fell into the hands of the investigators were documents. Among them was Aisu's passport. This was the very document, the absence of which made the version of her departure possible. This moment became decisive. If the passport had been hidden under the floor and kept in the apartment all these years, then no trips existed. The woman could not have left for another city, let alone abroad. But the findings did not end there. In the recess lay another item, an ordinary hammer with a wooden handle. At first glance, it was no different from a common tool found in any home. But specialists immediately noticed characteristic stains on the striking face. The color and structure of these traces suggested that the tool might have been used at the time of the tragedy. The item was carefully packed, sealed, and entered into the list of evidence. It was sent for further forensic examination to confirm or refute its connection to the injuries found on the woman. Thus, the repeated search yielded two key results. First, Aisu's passport was found, which completely destroyed the story of her long departure. Second, a potential instrument that could have been the murder weapon was discovered. These findings changed the course of the case. Now, the investigation had not only circumstantial evidence and witness testimonies, but also material evidence that directly linked the husband to what happened. After documenting the findings, the apartment was sealed and the items were sent for examination. Investigators understood. If the analysis confirmed the origin of the stains on the hammer, the evidence against Namjil would become almost irrefutable. The case was moving into a new phase, where the main task remained to establish the exact mechanism of events and confirm intent. The next step was obvious: the examination of the evidence and its legal consolidation in the case files. When investigators found the hammer under the floorboards, it was immediately entered into the protocol and carefully packed in special containers. Such items attract attention not only by their condition, but also by the context in which they are found. This was not a tool lying in plain sight in a drawer with other items, but one deliberately hidden under the flooring next to Aisu's documents. The very fact of concealment indicated that the apartment owner did not want anyone to stumble upon this item. External inspection showed brownish traces remained on the striking face and part of the wooden handle, and they looked as if they had formed a long time ago. Investigators did not rush to conclusions on the spot, but even to an unprofessional eye, it was clear. The hammer was clearly not used for repairs. After all the paperwork was completed, the tool was sent to the laboratory. There, it underwent several stages of research. First, specialists documented its external appearance, photographed it from all sides, measured its dimensions, and compiled a description down to the scratches on the handle. Then came the time for primary analysis. Chemists use standard rapid tests that react to biological fluids. The procedure is simple. A small amount of material is removed from the surface of the item and placed in a reagent. If it changes color, it means the traces are indeed related to blood. In this case, the reaction appeared instantly. This result alone gave an understanding that what they had was not accidental dirt, not paint, and not rust. These were indeed traces of blood. But the most important part was ahead, determining whose blood it was. The laboratory conducted a full cycle of genetic examination. Several samples were taken from the hammer's surface to rule out the possibility of error. Each sample went through the stage of DNA extraction, amplification, and further comparison with control data. The control data in this case was the genetic profile previously taken from Aisu's remains during the forensic medical examination. The results were unambiguous, a 100% match. Traces of Aisu Bat Erdane's blood were preserved on the hammer. The next stage was no less important. It was necessary to establish whether this particular tool could have caused the injuries recorded on the victim. Traceology experts conducted a whole range of procedures. First, they took detailed pictures of the bone injuries, then created three-dimensional models of these areas. After that, they compared the shape of the hammer's striking face with the nature of the fractures. The dimensions, depth, and contours matched down to the smallest detail. The specialist's conclusion was clear and without reservation. The nature of the injuries completely corresponds to blows inflicted by this particular hammer. Thus, the investigation received several key confirmations. First, the tool was found in the suspect's apartment, and it was hidden, which already indicates an attempt to conceal evidence. Second, biological traces were preserved on the hammer, which the laboratory unmistakably identified as Aisu's blood. Third, the bone injuries matched the shape and parameters of this tool. All this data combined transformed an ordinary household item into direct and irrefutable evidence of the crime. Now the case was moving into a new phase. The investigation no longer needed to make assumptions or limit itself to circumstantial evidence. In their hands was an item that linked Aisu and Namjil at the time of the tragedy, and this item became the central element of the accusation. Based on the examinations, the investigation was preparing to formally press charges, and the collected evidence was to become the foundation of the future trial. Investigators understood, even if they already had the hammer with a brownish residue, even if genetic expertise showed a match, and even if the logic of events pointed directly to the husband, this was still not enough to close the case. A criminal case always requires full examination of all possible scenarios, even the most unlikely. Otherwise, in court, the defense could argue that the investigation initially followed a predetermined line, without considering alternatives. That is why the work at this stage became painstaking, methodical, and very extensive. The first step was a detailed study of Aisu's surroundings. To do this, they requested lists of employees from her former workplace, checked relatives' addresses, and compiled a list of people she regularly contacted. Investigators called colleagues, met with neighbors in the area, and interviewed family acquaintances. Dry phrases appeared in the protocols, characterized positively, reserved, had no bad habits. No mention of conflicts, debts, or lawsuits was found. Bank security services confirmed no credit disputes were listed against her. Medical institutions did not record any appeals related to conflict situations. Her life seemed maximally calm and inconspicuous. When it came to family, investigators were obliged to check absolutely everyone, even the closest ones. Therefore, attention shifted to the son and daughter who had long lived in the capital. First, they checked phone billing, where their devices were during the critical period of 2019. Then they requested official data on attendance at university classes and workplaces. All this information came together to form one picture. Both were in Ulaanbaatar, hundreds of kilometers from Darkhan, at the time of their mother's disappearance. For greater reliability, their friends, colleagues, and dormitory neighbors were additionally interviewed. Their words fully coincided with the documentary data. The investigation had no doubt about their alibi. The next step was to rule out third-party involvement. For this, forensic experts re-examined the apartment's front door. The locks were found to be in perfect working order, with no signs of forced entry or picking. The windows were also checked. The latches were intact, with no signs of external entry. Moreover, neighbors recalled that they had not seen any suspicious guests at Namjil's during all this time. No one came late at night. No one stayed in the apartment longer than usual. The atmosphere around the family itself gave the impression of isolation, not openness to outsiders. Investigators compared all this data. Aisu had no external enemies. The son and daughter had no physical possibility of being nearby during the critical period. No external entry into the apartment was recorded. It turned out that all alternative versions automatically fell away. And the more thoroughly these lines were worked out, the more obvious it became that the only person with motive, opportunity, and full access remained one: her husband. At this stage, the picture for the investigation began to take final shape. The random intruder version was dismissed. The voluntary departure version was shattered by the passport, phone, and banking data. The family conflict involving other relatives version was not confirmed. The circle closed. All roads led to Namjil. And now investigators had the opportunity to move on to the next step, forming an accusation based not only on circumstantial evidence, but also on direct evidence collected during the investigation. When investigators had gathered the basic evidence in the file, the found package, the hammer with brownish residue, and digital data, they understood. This was not enough for a full accusation. The court requires not only material evidence, but also an understanding of why a person might commit a crime. That is why the focus of the investigation shifted to Namjil's personality. Investigators began to delve into his past, study his behavior, and interview relatives and colleagues. They needed to understand what lay behind the facade of the quiet husband and neighbor that everyone knew him to be. The first step was re-interviewing close relatives. This time, the conversations were not limited to general statements, but were built on specific clarifying questions. Relatives were asked to recall everyday scenes, the content of arguments, and what they noticed in the spouse's communication. The picture began to change. It turned out that Aisu and Namjil's relationship had never been cloudless. If they maintained an appearance of calm in public, conflicts regularly erupted at home. The central theme was money. Namjil strictly controlled all expenses, demanding that all family spending go through him. Aisu repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction, and this most often became the reason for arguments. Relatives emphasized he did not tolerate objections on financial matters, perceiving them as a challenge to his authority. In parallel, the investigation requested documents on his employment. On paper, his work experience looked solid, but when official responses arrived, it became clear. A turning point occurred in 2019. A few weeks before Aisu's disappearance, he lost his job. The wording, "by mutual agreement," looked formal, but for investigators, it was an unambiguous signal. The loss of income coincided with his wife's disappearance. It is likely that this fact became the catalyst for the events. Further checks showed that he had concealed information about his dismissal. Relatives and children were convinced that their father continued to work. According to them, he left home early every morning and returned in the evening, creating the illusion of a normal schedule. This behavior seems strange. Why maintain such a deception? But, for the investigation, everything fit into a logical chain. He did not want his family to know the truth. Having lost stable earnings and status, he was in a state of constant stress and fear of exposure. Witness testimonies allowed for a reconstruction of the scene. During that period, arguments between the spouses became more frequent. Aisu expressed dissatisfaction that money was being delayed and expenses were restricted, but she did not know the main thing. Her husband was no longer working. For investigators, this was an important finding, a hidden crisis that he could not voice, and tension within the family only grew. 3 key elements appeared in the case files that defined the motive. First, chronic domestic conflicts over finances that had dragged on for years. Second, sudden dismissal in 2019, which coincided with his wife's disappearance. Third, conscious lies, maintained daily, when he continued to go to work, although in reality he had no place of employment. This trio of factors painted a clear portrait of a man in a dead end, without income, unable to confess to his family, and under constant fear of exposure. For the investigation, this meant that they now had not only the murder weapon and direct evidence, but also a psychological basis that explained the motive. Namjil was no longer just the owner of the apartment where the remains were found. He became a figure whose biography and actions fit into a coherent logic of the investigation. Financial collapse, lies, and the inability to confess to his wife became the key to understanding why the events of 2019 ended in tragedy. This conclusion became another strong link in the accusation. The investigation could move to the next level, preparing the case for presentation in court, where motive, evidence, and testimonies were to form a single system of proof. Namjil's interrogation was not just another procedure, it became the central point of the entire investigation. On that day, the investigators prepared especially thoroughly. All the key evidence collected over several months of painstaking work was laid out on the table. The atmosphere in the room was cold, official, but it was this dryness and restraint that made every word weighty. Namjil sat opposite, outwardly calm, although it was noticeable that his internal tension was growing. He understood the situation had changed, and now he would not be able to limit himself to the usual words that his wife had left. The investigator began the interrogation without unnecessary introductions. There was neither vocal pressure nor direct threats. He acted according to a practiced scheme, presenting evidence one after another. The first item on the table was the mobile phone found in the apartment. This was the very device Aisu used. The investigator noted, the last activity occurred in 2019. Since then, the device had not connected to the network again. This meant that the version of her departure immediately collapsed, as the woman could not communicate from another country, leaving her phone at home. Then, a second item appeared on the table, the passport. It was discovered in a hidden compartment under the floor. This document finally ruled out the possibility that Aisu could have left the city. She simply had no chance to leave the country, let alone her region. The investigator emphasized no border crossings, no registrations, no traces of her official existence after 2019. And finally, the third item was a transparent bag with a hammer. Stains were visible on its surface, which immediately caught the eye. This was the moment when the tension in the room reached its peak. The investigator unfolded the papers and read out the results of the examination. The stains on the striking face were blood. Moreover, the conducted DNA examination showed a complete match with Aisu's biological profile. This meant that the item was not just found in the apartment, but also directly linked Namjil to his wife's death. The suspect's reaction was recorded in the protocol. Before this, he answered in monosyllables, pretending not to understand the essence of the presented facts. But after the analysis results were read out, he abruptly changed. He lowered his gaze, stopped looking at the investigator, and fell silent for a long time. He tried to say something several times, but the words never came out. At this moment, it became clear. The defense was crumbling. The investigator did not rush. He gave time for the suspect to grasp the situation. And then he took the last, most important step. He did not ask directly about the murder, did not demand explanations about the found remains. Instead, he uttered a phrase that struck at the very core. Did she find out you were fired, and was that what caused the conflict? This remark sounded calm, but it contained the motive that the investigation had established earlier. These words became a turning point. Before this, Namjil could deny the evidence, saying that his wife had forgotten her phone or didn't have time to take her passport. But now, it was about what truly linked the events of 2019. He had hidden his dismissal, hidden financial problems, and most likely, this led to the conflict. For the first time, a noticeable reaction appeared on the suspect's face. He looked away from the evidence, began to fidget in his chair, trying to find words. His outward composure disappeared. After several minutes of silence, he began to speak. His speech was disjointed, uneven. At first, these were isolated phrases, not connected into a coherent narrative. He spoke of fatigue, of arguments, of not wanting it to happen that way, but it did. All this was recorded on a dictaphone. The investigation got what it had been striving for several months. The suspect began to give a confession. This moment was a true culmination. Before this, the investigation only had evidence and circumstantial proofs. Now, the voice of the very person who had hidden the truth all these years emerged. The interrogation transformed a collection of facts into a unified picture. From this moment, the case entered a new phase, where the main task became to record every detail of the confession, restore the exact chronology of events of 2019, and definitively prove that Aisu's disappearance was not accidental, but the result of her husband's conscious actions. When the confession was heard in the interrogation room, the tension reached its peak. Investigators understood. Words are only half the battle. In legal practice, it has often happened that people agreed to charges simply because they were tired of pressure or tried to mitigate their fate. Therefore, confessions alone cannot close a case. Specifics were needed, details that no outsider could know unless they themselves were a participant in what happened. It was then that the investigator made a move that, in such situations, decides everything. He asked an unambiguous question, a question that required a precise answer. He asked, where did Aisu's clothes disappear to? The very clothes in which she was last seen in 2019. Silence hung in the room. Namjil sat, eyes downcast, and it seemed he was struggling with himself. His forehead was covered in sweat, his fingers intertwined. For a few seconds he was silent, and one could hear the clock ticking in the room. It seemed he was still trying to decide, to remain silent or to tell the truth. But then, almost in a whisper, he uttered words that changed the course of the case. He named a specific place, in the basement, in the ventilation shaft. The words sounded muffled, as if torn from the depths of his consciousness. For the investigators, this was a signal. If he was lying, the deception would be exposed very quickly. But if he was telling the truth, then this detail would become crucial, because in no protocol, in no report on the basement inspection, was there any such mention. That same night, they drew up an order for a repeated inspection of the house. In the morning, with the first group of operatives, with witnesses and forensic experts, they descended into the basement. The basement itself was a gloomy, abandoned room. Concrete walls were covered with damp stains, old dust everywhere, and rust marks on the pipes. The air was thick, heavy, smelling of mustiness. Lamps dimly lit the passages, and every step echoed loudly. The investigators moved methodically, checking every corner, recording everything with photos and videos. Finally, they approached the ventilation opening. At first glance, it was no different from the others, but careful inspection revealed an important detail. The grate was not screwed on like the others. It was slightly crooked, and a fresh scratch was visible on one of the fastenings, as if it had recently been opened. An operative carefully removed the grate, illuminating the inside with a flashlight. Something glimmered deep in the shaft. With the help of a hook, they retrieved a bundle, an old plastic bag, tightly tied. Its surface was covered with a layer of dust and cobwebs, but it was clear that it had once been deliberately hidden there. All actions were recorded, and witnesses signed the protocols. When the bag was opened, women's clothes were found inside. The items were folded neatly as if they were prepared for storage. The fabric colors had faded, but the overall appearance was preserved. Aisu's relatives immediately recognized the items. She had been seen in such an outfit shortly before her disappearance. The embroidered blouse particularly stood out, details that could not be mistaken for anything else. For the investigation, this find was of immense value. First, it confirmed the suspect's words. Only he could have known where the clothes had disappeared. Second, the items became material evidence. Traces remained on the fabric, which forensic experts immediately seized for examination. In the laboratory, it was later established there were traces of blood, completely matching Aisu's biological profile. This put a definitive end to the question. Could Namjil have falsely incriminated himself? No, he named the exact location and described the contents beforehand. At this moment, the puzzle finally came together. The confession was supported by evidence, and from now on, the suspect's defense could not claim that pressure had forced him to confess. Too many coincidences, too many details that matched witness testimonies and expert results. Now, the investigation had not only his confession, but also proof that it was true. This discovery became a turning point. The case, which had long appeared to be a series of circumstantial evidence and suspicions, now found a solid foundation. The investigation gained the key to understanding how the events of that fateful night unfolded. The most important task remained: to reconstruct the full picture of what happened from Namjil's own words and to consolidate it in the case materials so that no doubts could shake the final conclusion. Official documents and interrogation protocols recorded the full picture of how that evening in 2019 unfolded. Namjil, already burdened by irrefutable evidence, gave detailed testimony. He stated that everything began with an ordinary conversation about household matters, but gradually the dialogue escalated into a serious conflict. Aisu, according to him, had learned that he was hiding his dismissal. For several months, he continued to leave home in the morning, as if for work, and returned in the evening, trying to maintain his usual routine so that no one would suspect anything. In reality, he had not been working for a long time and had no regular income. This became a source of constant tension. According to Namjil, his wife directly asked him about money and why the accounts were empty. The conversation quickly turned to reproaches and accusations, and each of them raised their voice more and more. The investigation noted that Namjil's confession lacked emotional coloring, but the details confirmed the domestic nature of the conflict. On that day, he was in a room where minor repairs were being done. Tools were lying there, including a hammer. Namjil confessed. In the heat of the argument, he grabbed the item and hit his wife on the head. His words were recorded in the protocol without additional details. Took, hit. He emphasized that he did it in a state of affect and that everything happened suddenly. Aisu immediately lost consciousness. Namjil approached closer, bent down to her, and realized that she was not breathing. During the interrogation, he noted, "I realized she was dead." After this event, by his own admission, he panicked. But the fear of the police and prison turned out to be stronger than any other feelings. Namjil was sure that if he sought help, he would immediately be accused of intentional crime and imprisoned. At that moment, he decided not to call anyone. Another motive he himself stated concerned his family. He confessed that he was afraid of exposure in the eyes of his loved ones. His words were recorded in the protocol. "I didn't want the children to know that their father was a murderer." He then began to act methodically. To conceal the traces of what had happened, Namjil used fabrics, film, salt, and lime, trying to prevent any smell. He moved everything into a separate room, which he then closed. This room became a hiding place for many years, into which no one but himself entered. His subsequent actions only confirmed that he was consciously building an illusion. He began to correspond on behalf of his wife, using her accounts. The messages were short: "I'm fine, I'll be back soon." To maintain credibility, he periodically bought women's clothing, personal hygiene products, sometimes even ordered goods that Aisu supposedly used. All this was aimed at one thing: to preserve for those around him the illusion that she was still alive, just away. In the eyes of neighbors and relatives, the situation seemed plausible. No one filed reports, as everyone was convinced by the version voiced by Namjil himself. Only years later did a random complaint about a smell become the starting point for uncovering this story. But the suspect's confession definitively confirmed Aisu's disappearance in 2019 was not voluntary and was not related to her departure. It was a conflict within the family that ended tragically. Based on these confessions and the collected evidence, the investigation established a key conclusion. Aisu did not leave the house herself. Her disappearance was carefully staged. Namjil maintained the lie for several years, creating the appearance of a normal life, although in reality, his own secret had been with him all this time. Now the investigation's task was to formally establish a full evidentiary basis and prepare the materials for submission to the court. After the confession, which was recorded in the protocol, the investigators set a new task: to reconstruct the full picture of events, not just to understand the general course of the case, but to meticulously track exactly what Namjil did on the day of the tragedy and in subsequent years. Reconstruction became a necessary element. Without it, it would be impossible to show the court the scale and systematic nature of his actions. Every movement, every action had to be confirmed and placed in a strict chronology. From the case materials, it is known. Immediately after the conflict and the blow, Namjil made no attempts to call for help. He did not call an ambulance or the police. Instead, he almost immediately began to act as if he had a plan thought out in advance. First, he went to hardware stores. There he bought bags of salt, lime, several pieces of thick fabric, construction film, and rope. The receipts allowed them to establish the exact time and even specific retail outlets. This data later became part of the criminal case materials as evidence of preparation for concealment. Upon returning home, he processed his find in the room. First, he covered it with salt, then added lime. All of this was done to slow down natural processes. Next, he wrapped the bundle in cloth, then plastic film, and tied it tightly with rope. The resulting package was large and heavy, but he carefully carried it to the farthest room, which was practically unused. This room later became a hiding place where he allowed no one else. He kept the door locked, and the key was always with him. Namjil did not stop there. He understood that physical concealment alone was not enough. Sooner or later, his wife's absence would raise questions. Therefore, he decided to construct a legend, to create the illusion that Aisu had simply left and continued to live somewhere far away. To do this, he began actively using her phone. He logged into accounts, sending short messages to relatives and children. The content of these messages was always the same and as neutral as possible. "I'm fine. I'll be back soon. Don't worry." They lacked personal details characteristic of genuine communication. Not one call, not one video chat, only short texts. But this proved sufficient to calm his loved ones for a time. When someone asked directly where Aisu was, he responded evasively. To the children, he said their mother had communication problems or was too busy. To neighbors, he reported that his wife had gone to visit relatives, but he did not provide a specific address or return date. In rare cases, he even showed his phone screen with new messages, supposedly confirming his words. All of this created an illusion of plausibility. He maintained this entire scheme for 4 years. All this time, Namjil lived in the same apartment. He continued to use the kitchen, watch television, and follow his usual routes. But one room, he turned into a forbidden zone. When guests came over, he kept them in the hallway, or, at most, in the kitchen. If anyone tried to go further, he found a reason to stop them, saying there was a renovation, or that Aisu was resting, or that the door was locked. In this way, he strictly controlled the space. For even greater persuasiveness, he occasionally bought women's items. The case materials recorded purchases of hygiene products, women's clothing, and accessories. These purchases were later confirmed by sales receipts and vendor testimonies. The investigation interpreted all of this as deliberate actions to create the illusion of a woman's presence in the house. This is how Namjil lived side by side with the carefully hidden bundle. 4 years. That is 1,460 days. Every day he entered the apartment, knowing that behind the closed door lay proof of his deed. Every day he maintained the deception. Correspondence on behalf of his wife, false explanations to relatives and neighbors, purchases creating the appearance of a normal family life. This reconstruction showed the investigation the scale of his work. This was not a random act or an impulsive reaction, but a systematic and cold-blooded concealment. Everything looked like a carefully constructed scheme, where each step had its place and purpose. This logic of actions became decisive in preparing the case for court. Investigators were able to show that it was not a domestic conflict, but a multi-layered deception stretched over years. This conclusion became the key to the next stage, the legal formalization of the charges, the formation of the final investigative position, and preparation for the trial. The trial of Namjil Bat Erdeni became the culmination of the entire story, a long, agonizing, and terrifying one. Everything that happened up to this point, the painstaking investigation, the search for evidence, endless interrogations and examinations, finally took shape in strict legal documents. Every line of the indictment was meticulously verified and checked. The prosecution approached the court with such a volume of evidence that virtually no doubt remained. The accusation was formulated clearly and extremely specifically. The main article concerned the intentional deprivation of his spouse's life, with separate episodes highlighted related to the subsequent concealment actions. The prosecution insisted he not only committed the crime, but also maintained a carefully constructed lie for 4 long years, deceiving relatives, neighbors, colleagues, and even his own children. This fact, in the prosecution's opinion, made his act even more cruel and cynical. When the prosecutor first read the charges in the courtroom, the atmosphere became extremely tense. Everyone present awaited Namjil's reaction. He could continue to deny, he could try to justify himself, but instead, he chose another path: confession. His words sounded restrained, almost detached. He confirmed everything the investigators already knew. There were no loud statements, no attempts to elicit sympathy. It seemed he was simply stating a fact with which he no longer intended to argue. But the confession did not simplify the process. The defense tried to find even the slightest mitigation for him. Lawyers spoke of his severe psychological state, that in 2019, he was under pressure from many circumstances: job loss, constant family conflicts, fear of exposure. According to their version, he acted in a state of strong emotional tension, and therefore, it was not a cold-blooded calculation, but a fit of passion. They insisted, yes, he is guilty, but the punishment should take these nuances into account. The prosecution, however, built a completely different case. The prosecutor reminded the court that everything that happened after the fateful evening completely refuted the version of accidental circumstances. The purchase of special materials, the creation of his wife's digital persona, the sending of messages on her behalf, the maintenance of the departure legend for 4 years. This was not a fit of passion, but cold, deliberate, and systematic work to cover up traces. Moreover, the prosecution emphasized that these actions inflicted additional pain on the family and loved ones, who continued to live in expectation, believing in the legend created by Namjil. The court carefully listened to both sides. Every argument was recorded, every detail discussed. The judge analyzed not only emotional arguments, but also facts confirmed by documents, expert opinions, and witness testimonies. During the sessions, it was clear, despite the defense's attempts to mitigate the situation, the factual side of the case was too severe. The admission of guilt only solidified the investigation's conclusions, rather than easing his responsibility. On the day the verdict was announced, a special silence filled the hall. It seemed that even the air grew heavier. The judge spoke in dry, official language, but every word carried weight. First, the articles under which he was found guilty were listed. Then it was explained in detail why the defense's arguments about a state of affect found no confirmation. Namjil's actions after the tragedy were too methodical and prolonged. Everything indicated that he understood what he was doing, and did it consciously. And finally, the main pronouncement was made: guilty. The court sentenced him to a long term of imprisonment, effectively bringing this story to an end. This was a verdict that not only determined his future fate, but also became a kind of finale to years of lies, deception, and horror that surrounded his family and loved ones. For those who followed the case, this moment was both a relief and a shock. Relief, because the truth finally received legal confirmation. Shock, because it became definitively clear how far a person can go to conceal their actions. The case was closed, but with it ended not only the story of the crime, but also an entire era in the lives of the family, neighbors, and friends. People who had lived in ignorance for 4 years received answers, but these answers turned out to be so terrifying that the residue of them remained forever, thus ended the trial. But the trace left by this story remained much deeper than the lines in the verdict. It remained in the memory of the people who were part of this tragedy, and became a subject of discussion for society as a whole, as an example of what a person is capable of when caught in the grip of lies and fear. The story did not end with the court's verdict. On the contrary, it was from this moment that a new, even more difficult stage began for the family. The process lasted months, and all this time, loved ones held a tiny hope. Maybe everything was a misunderstanding. Maybe their father would only admit to part of the guilt, and the rest would be a different, lighter charge. But after the verdict was announced, the illusions shattered. The sentence put a final end to it, and at that moment, for Aisu's children, everything collapsed at once. They lost their mother back in 2019, though then they thought she had simply left. For 4 long years, they believed the messages that came to their phones. Short phrases, "Everything is fine," "I'll be back soon," "Don't worry." These lines sustained them, allowing them not to ask agonizing questions. But now it turned out that all these years, their own father had been playing a game with them. And when the truth came out, the blow was twice as hard. Not just the disappearance of their mother, but the betrayal of their father, who deprived them of both parents at once. After the trial, they completely refused contact with him. Not one letter, not one attempt to visit him. For them, he ceased to exist, as if he had never been. In official documents, he is still listed as their father, but in their hearts, they severed that connection. This break was silent, but absolute. And this is not surprising. When a person who should have been a pillar of support suddenly becomes a source of horror, there is no strength or desire left for reconciliation. They became orphans with a living parent. Such a situation is perhaps heavier than death itself, because in the case of loss, there is grief, but no betrayal. Here, there is double pain, the loss of a mother, and the realization that the one who remained was the one who deprived them of her. In an instant, their whole world turned into a scorched desert, where there is no past, no future, only a memory from which they want to escape. The fate of the apartment also became part of this terrible legacy. After the investigation, the dwelling was sealed, and then, once all evidence was removed, it turned into an empty box, full of dead silence. Relatives did not even try to live there. No one dared to cross the threshold. It seemed that the very atmosphere of the apartment was permeated with mystery and horror. Neighbors tried to avoid the door, and in conversations among themselves, they began to call it the apartment with the mummy. This name stuck so firmly that even in sales advertisements, people found a reason to refuse upon learning of its past. Several times, enterprising agents tried to put it on the market, offering a price below market value, but it was all useless. No one wanted to associate their life with a place where a terrible secret had been hidden for 4 years. Gradually, the apartment turned into a silent monument. In the evenings, its windows remained dark, and in the courtyard, children scared each other with stories about that apartment. Even casual passersby, hearing the address, recognized it and fell silent. Thus, the space that was once a home for a family turned into a symbol of destruction. And if one recalls what this apartment was like before, the contrast becomes almost unbearable. After all, it was here that the family gathered at the table, celebrated holidays, and entertained guests. Laughter and conversations echoed here, life buzzed. But after 2019, everything changed, and the walls absorbed completely different memories: darkness, silence, and loneliness. Now, this house has become for the city an example of how one crime can turn a living space into a place from which people turn away. But the most chilling aspect of this story is its ultimate paradox. Namjil kept insisting. He wanted to save his family. He wanted the children to think their mother was alive and somewhere far away, to continue to feel her presence. It was for this very reason that he falsified messages and invented the legend of her departure. In his mind, this looked like an attempt to protect his family from pain, but in reality, his actions destroyed everything. Aisu is no more. The children lost both their mother and father simultaneously. The apartment turned into a place that no one even wants to see now. The Batterdani family name became associated not with respect and memory, but with a terrible story whispered by neighbors. And it turns out that all of Namgil's efforts led to exactly the opposite result. Instead of preserving the family, it's complete destruction instead of protection, total ruin instead of love, cold lies and consequences. What he called care actually turned out to be betrayal. His words, "I wanted to save the family," resulted in the complete collapse of everything they had. Now, only a trace remains in criminal cases, articles in newspapers, and an empty apartment that serves as a reminder that sometimes one lie can tear down an entire life, leaving ruins where there was once warmth and light.